And again, if you're just joining us, my name is Larissa Snorek. I'm a Christian Science practitioner based in Boston, Massachusetts. And this talk tonight is sponsored by First Church of Christ Scientists in Austin, Texas. As we get started with the healing power of stillness, I'd love you just to think as you're listening tonight about how you're listening. And let me explain that for a minute. So as I'm sharing with you all through this Zoom web chat, the things that have meant a lot to me in my life, the things that have come up from my experience, as I share with you from my heart, I hope that you hear your own heart speaking tonight. And I want you to listen even more than you listen to what I'm saying. Just listen to your own heart speaking, because that's the real message that you came for this evening, and probably the most important thing that you'll hear all night. So just as you're listening and paying attention, pay also attention to what's coming up for you in your own heart. And that's the most important message you'll hear. We'll start off tonight setting the stage for the healing power of stillness with this story about a cellist in Sarajevo. So we're going to go back in time to 1992. And on this day, a man walks into the center square of Sarajevo, and he plunks down a plastic chair and a cello case, and he takes out his instrument, and he sits down in the chair, and he starts to play. And as he plays the cello, and the sounds of the cello fill the square behind him, in the backdrop, there are artillery shells falling on buildings, and people are running for cover. It's the start of the Bosnian Civil War. This man, Vedran Smolovic, is the principal cellist of the Sarajevo Opera Orchestra. And he comes into this place in Sarajevo not just one time to play cello, but for 22 consecutive days. And he does this to commemorate 22 men, women, and children that were killed in the start of the war while waiting in a bread line. This is his response to what he sees going on around him in his beloved city of Sarajevo. He doesn't know how to broker a ceasefire between the warring parties or figure out the end of the conflict, but he can bring his music, what he was designed to share, and a little bit of that harmony into the chaos that he sees around him. Now, when I heard this story years ago for the first time, it occurred to me that it just made me think, I guess, what would it take? What kind of deep, settled calm would it take to go into a war zone like that, regardless of your own safety, and sit there amidst all the chaos and play music? Well, I don't know what it was for him, but for me, what it says about stillness is that we're not looking to change our outside environment to find stillness. The stillness we'll be talking about tonight is a mental quality of thought. It's about quieting all the racing thoughts in our minds and putting those aside so that we can find a deep, settled calm that's already within every one of you who's listening tonight. It's not something you have to get by changing your environment. It's something that we can bring to no matter how much chaos we see around us, that when we connect with this stillness in our own heart, that as we practice to maintain that attitude and that sense of stillness, that presence of stillness, that we can go out into the busiest day of our lives, or the most chaotic situation with our kids, or the most difficult situation with colleagues, or in a work setting, and bring that stillness to everything we do. It then changes our environment, as opposed to us being changed by our environment. That when we locate and really settle into that deep, settled calm, we can bring it to even a war zone like this man did when he sat in the middle of Sarajevo and played his cello. The quote that you'll see on your screen now, and if any of you are on the phone, I'll repeat the quote for you. It just says, "At the center of the most turbulent heart There is a place of peace, a place beyond time that cannot be touched by change or loss. No tumult can disturb the quietness. No shadow can dim the light. Here, in this stillness is rest and healing. Nothing we suffer, nothing we fear can damage its perfection. Now, I hope you can hear in this statement, it's by a woman named Pam Brown, and I've looked for the source, but it was something someone sent me over Facebook years ago. But the idea in it that I hope you can hear is that the stillness we're looking for is already within our hearts. It's already something that we have. We don't have to go changing our circumstances or our environment or our situation or our relationships or our job to find it. That we find that stillness by looking within, where we already, it's deeper in how we're created than anything else. And all of the events of our life, no matter how disturbing they may have been or how chaotic they can be on any given day, they can't touch that deep settled sense of calm and stillness. Everything that you'll hear today in this talk is based on two books that Christian Science is based on. So the first one is the Bible, and the second book is the book Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures, written by Mary Baker Eddy. It is the definitive textbook on Christian Science healing, which is based in the Bible. It's based in following the way that Jesus healed. And if you're new at all to those two words of Christian and science, or maybe not Christian, but Christian Science, those two words together, often the Christian part is well understood. We're part of Christianity. We follow Jesus. We follow the Bible. And we really emphasize in the Bible following the way Jesus showed us to live, and that's the real essence of being a Christian is trying and striving to live in the way Jesus lived. And then the science part, which sometimes people get a little caught up on, but the science part really, in essence, what it means for us in Christian Science is that when you're looking for the authority for practicing Christianity, you find it in experimenting and testing it out in your own life, the Christian principles that are in the Bible. It's not enough to just have faith in them and hope that they work. Just like if you were going to a science class here in where I'm from in America, or perhaps in your own country, that if you were going to a physics class, for example, or a chemistry class, and you were supposed to do a lab for that particular class, and you were taking the principles you learned in class and putting them into practice in the lab, and then supposed to write up your results, and you decided to go to class and tell your teacher, well, I didn't bother doing the lab because, well, I have faith that the principle works, and so isn't that enough? Well, at least in my experience, the teacher would not pass you if you did that for the class, because a science gets its authority for the principle by testing it out and seeing it in practice. And it's the same with the science of divinity, divine science, or that we take divine principles and the principles of Christianity, and we look at the way that they are lived out in life. And that's where we find our authority, not by just hearing someone else tell us about those ideas or just going to church and listening to them come from a church service, but really living them in our own lives. That's that science part. And that's what Mary Baker Eddy wrote about in her book. Now, there's two ideas from those, one from each of the books, that will be our kind of keynote ideas for this evening. The first one is from Psalms 46. Now, if you haven't read Psalms 46 in a while, it's a good read. And if you like homework after an event like this, you can take that as your homework to go read Psalms 46 in whatever Bible you like to read it in. But it's basically a psalm about turbulence and about chaos and about all of the stress and pressures, in a way, that we can feel in our lives. In Bible terms, in the psalm, it talks about the earth shaking and the waters being troubled and the earth melting, et cetera, et cetera. But it's really all about a very turbulent time. And at the end of the psalm, it has this little phrase, be still and know that I am God. I hope you can hear two things in that phrase. The first part being about being, be still. That it's really a statement about how we're being more than what we do in life. So often we, especially in America at least, and perhaps in many Western countries nowadays, we can really get caught up in thinking of ourselves as human doings. We're so busy with filling our lives with things that we're doing, that it's rare that we stop to consider our beingness within all the doing. And yet, for those of us that are curious about spiritual things and the spiritual path in life, and that, or even just being curious about stillness, that it requires us to look at those qualities of being as at the heart of who we are and what's important. And it's a real shift from how we might tend to go about thinking during our day. And I think that this is deeply ingrained in our culture, especially in America, because as a young child, even when we're in school here in America, we often get asked by our teachers in elementary school, what do you want to be when you grow up? But how do students often answer that? Well, they often answer it with what they want to do. I'd like to be a librarian or a truck driver or a lawyer, etc., a teacher. So, and those are the answers the teacher's looking for. In fact, I have an acquaintance on social media who posted a post not too long ago that said that when he was a child, he used to answer that question by saying, what do I want to be when I grow up? I want to be happy. But the teacher would say, wrong answer, because they were really looking just for what kind of profession do you want to do. But it just shows us how early on in Western culture we get focused on confusing being and doing, that we think it's enough to just figure out what we want to do. But what this little phrase is inviting us to do, and what I'm inviting us all to do tonight, is to consider our beingness as the place where stillness resides. And that when we can set aside all of the human doing and just focus on our human beingness, that's where we discover the stillness that's already within, that we already have within us. So that's the first part of this little phrase. Now the second part is the knowing part, and it's also really key. Be still is really a statement about quieting all the ramblings in our minds, in our heads on any given day. But then it's not enough to just empty out our thoughts. The next part is to really fill up with that sense of knowing God, knowing that I am God. Now, when we talk about God in Christian Science, it's really important that we don't imagine a personified image of some being out there somewhere. Anytime we think about God as something out there that we're praying to, that we're appealing to, it's a false image for us in Christian Science of what God is. That God is at the heart of our beingness, that we live at one with God. There's a oneness between each one of us and God, the divine nature of us and God. So we find God not by looking out there somewhere, but by looking within. And that sense of God it's a divine power. It's divine love at the heart of who we are. And it's a law. It's like a law of divine love that operates on our behalf. It's as close to us as a drop of water is to the ocean, or a ray of sunlight is to the sunbeam, to the sun itself, or the song is to the singer. You can't separate the song from the person singing it. They have different qualities, but they're really part of the same entity. And that's what each one of us is like with God. So when we look for God, when we talk about knowing God, It's knowing part of our own nature, our own being, not looking for some being out there that we hope will intervene in our lives and help us somehow. And maybe it'll work if we have enough faith, and maybe it won't if we don't. That is just a false sense of God. It's not a reliable God. We don't really know if that kind of a God is going to help us out or not. The God we're looking to is a God that's always a presence, the divine presence. And we feel it in moments of stillness. We feel that oneness when we get still. Now, Mary Baker Eddy, in her book, Science and Health, gave us a little indication of stillness when she talked about hearing God or hearing spirit when the senses are silent. So again, just that the importance of quieting the racing thoughts. And how to do that is sort of, there's infinite ways, I think, but how we quiet those racing thoughts, it starts by just having that desire to find the quiet in our thinking, in our whole being, to just put aside what we're doing for a moment and to just consider, what is my being right now? What's going on in my being? Am I anxious? Am I worried? Am I thinking about what's going to happen in 5 minutes? Am I worried about what happened 20 minutes ago or yesterday or last year? Am I concerned that something's not going to work out in the future? Where is my being right now? And when we ask ourselves that, and we look really at getting quiet in our being and just putting aside all those thoughts, that's what it means to get the senses silent. And that's when we can start to feel that oneness. Now, we're going to talk today about stillness for the next about half hour, 40 minutes in 3 different parts. The first one is looking at practicing stillness for ourselves and how that brings healing power in our own lives. Then we're going to look at practicing stillness in relationship with others and how that can bring healing to us based on relationships. And then finally, we'll look at how do we practice stillness in light of things that are going on in the world, when there's things happening in the news or in government that are trying to agitate us. How do we remain still and stay focused on stillness and not get reactive or agitated based on world events? So those are the 3 parts that we'll talk about. To start, I just have a little analogy about this oneness that we talked about. And you'll see on your screen a cello, and my son plays cello. He's now in university, and he's playing cello at university, so he's played for about 15 years or so. And every week for many years when he was growing up, I would go to his lessons with him. And the first thing that you do in a cello lesson is that you have to tune the instrument. And to do this, the teacher will put on an electronic tuner. And the tuner plays this pure, perfect tone. And then you play the same note on the instrument. And inevitably, the instrument is out of tune. And so you'll see the little knobs on the bottom of your screen. Those are the fine-tuning knobs. And what would happen is my son would just turn those little knobs, and it would bring the instrument in line, perfectly in line with that pure, perfect tone. And when that would happen, one time I just closed my eyes and I couldn't distinguish the tuner and the cello. It just sounded like there was one note being played in the room. And that to me is what stillness feels like, that it's that sense of oneness, that we are what is being played by God, that we are not the doing, that God is what is doing and we are what is done. In other words, rather than feeling like we're sort of scurrying through life, trying to accomplish all kinds of things to get to a certain income level or a certain standard of living or a certain accomplishment in our work, that what stillness invites us to do is to put that aside, put those goals aside, and really connect with what's in our heart and to feel at the core of our being that oneness with divine presence. And when we do, it brings healing to our lives, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. The key here is to tune up. So just like a cellist has to tune to start off the lesson, Mary Vickeretti used this analogy, and she talked about keeping your violin in tune. That healing is like tuning up. And I like to think about this because it's when a violinist or a cellist or a professional musician starts off the day, they will tune their instrument before, say, they have a lesson in the morning that they're teaching or a practice for an orchestra. But they never expect that tuning that they did in the morning will last them the whole day. In fact, as they use their instrument, it naturally gets out of tune. It's designed to do that. So the musician is able to listen so carefully that they know when their instrument is getting a little out of tune, and they just make an adjustment and tune it right back up. And they do this throughout the day, before an orchestra performance, after intermission, before they teach a class, etc. And it's a great analogy for us with prayer and with stillness. That finding moments in our day to get still, to quiet all the doing and the thinking and the planning and the racing around, to just pause and check in with ourselves. Just check in. How am I being right now? What's my being like? How can I be still for just a moment? That's like a little tuning up that tunes us back in to feel that divine presence at the heart of who we are. It allows us to be more rested in life. It allows us to be more relaxed, more good-humored, to react less to others and to ourselves. And in just a minute, I'll share a story with you about that. But before I do, just go ahead and open your chat box if you haven't opened it already. And this is just an opportunity for you to share a few ideas. What I'd love for you to think about is, when do you know that you've found that feeling of oneness with divine presence? When you feel really at peace with yourself, what characterizes it? Go ahead and chat your answers in that chat box, and I'll just repeat them for anybody that can't see it or that's online, but or that's on the phone. But what does it look like for you when you know you've reached that sense of peace with yourself? How can you tell? So someone wrote in silence. So there's a great sense of silence. That's beautiful. That when we're at peace with ourselves, we feel that quiet in our being, that real sense of silence within. Even if it's loud outside of us, we can feel the silence within. Someone else, Lisa, wrote, when I smile, right? That's great, Lisa, actually, that being at peace with ourselves allows us to smile more readily, that we laugh more easily. Maybe we feel like we can smile at people on the street that we wouldn't normally smile at. Yep. It's sort of this overflowing love and joy that we feel. Chris wrote in about that it's a feeling of warmth and love. So you know you're at peace with yourself. Chris, that's great. When you feel that kind of that surrounding of love, that's great. Brad wrote a calm certainty. That's great. When we feel at peace with ourselves, we feel that calmness and that certainty so that we don't feel the need to stay in control all the time. I think that certainty is a certainty of knowing there's a divine presence present. And therefore, we don't have to be in charge so much. We can step back and let life unfold and trust it. Karen wrote in that, feeling at peace is really just focusing on kind of one idea. There's a great effort right now to focus on monotasking. We've gotten really good at multitasking, but there's new studies that have been done that actually we're less efficient sometimes when we multitask a lot, and that just focusing on one aspect we can be a lot more efficient. So that's great. We feel at peace with ourselves when we feel secure, Douglas said. Becky said, when I'm aware of harmony all around. So being at peace with yourself puts you in harmony with nature, with others, with the universe. It has that sense of harmony and that sense of security and safety, that when we're really at peace with ourselves, we're not anxious. It also tends to really ground us in the present moment. So when we're feeling at peace with ourselves, we're not anxious about the future or worried about the past. We're really living in the moment and celebrating the moment right now and realizing that's the only moment we really have. Sherry said that there's a gentle, encompassing love. That's beautiful, Sherry. You know, that being at peace with ourselves has the effect of helping us feel the loved nature that we are, to feel that sense of being loved. Just a couple more that I'll add to our list, and if you have more, feel free to remember them or chat them if you want to. But a couple other things that for me, when I'm really at peace with myself, I'm not so tempted to judge others or to judge myself or condemn myself. When I'm really at peace, I lose interest in conflict. I lose interest in perpetuating conflict and old issues, and it's really not that interesting anymore. And there's just that delight in life. And then I think we mentioned also that when you really feel at peace with yourself, you're willing to let go of control and feel that you can let things unfold and you can be part of that, as opposed to having to manage them all the time. And that last point about the willingness to relinquish a sense of control was really important for me years ago, when I had an experience where I was dealing with chronic issues of pain, and it was coming up in my neck and shoulders, and it would just reoccur every few months and would kind of come and go. And right before Christmas one year, when I had a huge event that I was planning for my family, on top of my very heavy workload and my responsibilities for children and pets and my home, I woke up 3 days before Christmas with just a really bad crick in my neck, and sort of had this stiffness that made it difficult to turn my head. And I grew up addressing all illness and all challenges through prayer, through this kind of getting still and feeling that presence of God. And so that was what I started with. However, there was, like I said, there was a lot going on. I was sort of in a really, felt like a high pressured situation with a lot of stress in my life at the time. And so my prayer was a little along the lines of, okay, God, I need a healing really quickly, because I have so much on my plate to get done over the next 3 days that I can't afford to have pain and to be uncomfortable. I really need this to be resolved so I can move forward with all the things I have to do. Now, who can you hear at the center of that prayer? Right? So I'm sort of focusing on myself and kind of keeping myself at the center of that prayer. And that wasn't a very effective approach to prayer. And the next day I woke up and I kind of kept going and was focused again on just really praying and wanting to connect with God and have that sense of oneness and divine presence that we talked about. But again, I was sort of keeping in mind all the things and all the responsibilities that I had and feeling the pressure of them. And so I realized my prayer, as I look back at it at least, was a little bit like I'm the CEO of my life. And God at the time was like this divine assistant, right? That we sort of call on and hope comes in and kind of helps me out and fixes the problem so I can get on with things. But I hope you can hear that that's counter to how we talked about God earlier. And I didn't realize I was doing this consciously, but because I felt so in charge of so many things and that so much was weighing on my shoulders, it felt like I was responsible for all of the projects that were ahead of me at that moment, that I just hadn't yet relinquished all that control. Well, the third day I woke up and I was in so much pain. It was absolutely excruciating. I had never felt such intense pain in my shoulders, and it was kind of frozen. I wasn't able to turn my head at all. And whatever was going on was so painful that even just walking would send shooting pains up the back of my neck. So at this point, I really was incapacitated. I was in bed. I had to stay in bed so I could try to avoid the shooting pain that I was experiencing. And I just needed to get still and shut the door mentally on all the racing thoughts and the feeling of responsibility and the feeling like it was all on my shoulders, all these things that I had to do. And that was hard. That took a couple of hours at least. But slowly I let go of feeling like I was in charge. I was the CEO, and I was trying to find a God to intervene and be my divine assistant. I kind of let that all go. And I started just finding that stillness and that peace. And in the quiet, I suddenly heard this message that was so clear. And the message just came across and it said, I am the shepherd. And I realized that was a message of divine presence, that being at peace is letting ourselves feel shepherded by divine presence, as opposed to being in charge all the time, that we're at the center of our lives, that our ego and our will and our to-do list is always at the center. That when we put that aside, what replaces it is this beautiful sense of the divine ego, the divine consciousness. That's sort of what all of us can feel, bigger than one of our minds. It's not all these little individual minds down here trying to figure it all out. We're in the stillness. We feel that oneness with divine consciousness. And so that's what this message was to me. It was a message directly from divine consciousness about my relationship to God and to myself. But as I thought about it, I realized that to accept that God was the shepherd, that there was this shepherding presence that I was meant to respond to, it meant that I had to really understand what it meant to be shepherded, like a sheep. And then I realized I didn't really like the idea of being a sheep. I much preferred to be the shepherd. At least that's how I felt at the time. This is another opportunity, if you want, to go ahead and chat in the chat box. What do you imagine are the good qualities of the sheep? So in other words, as I was sitting in bed and I could feel this being sort of a profound opportunity to learn something, and what I had to learn was what it meant to be a sheep with this divine idea of shepherd. Well, I was so biased against being a sheep. I grew up with this sense that, again, from elementary school here in America, with a teacher who said to me, don't ever be a sheep. Now, what did she mean? She meant that we shouldn't follow blindly our friends, right? We should think for ourselves and have leadership qualities. And that's good advice for not following your friends around. But in this instance, I needed to accept the qualities of being a sheep with a divine shepherd. So what are those qualities? What do you think? So Chris wrote in and said, an absolute faith to follow the shepherd. Yes. That the sheep absolutely trust their shepherd. Do you know that sheep will only drink by still waters? And so they trust that shepherd to find them those still waters. Sheep, thank you, Jessica. Yes, that sheep have a sense of humility, right? Which you can hear in my story was probably missing those first 2 days. When you feel like you're the CEO of your life, it can be difficult to remember to have that humility. But sheep represent that sense of humility. Yeah, Becky said total trust. Good. Barb said obedience. Yep. Lisa, thank you for receptivity. The sheep are receptive, that when they get direction, they're receptive to that direction, they follow. And they really stick to that sense of divine direction, of how they're being shepherded. Also, I recently learned that, sheep are these, we think of them as gentle, sort of innocent, sweet creatures. And yet if a wolf comes, and if the sheep can bind together in one, they can actually stifle the wolf in the middle of the pack and not have it hurt them. That there's such a sense of unity about sheep that they will actually squeeze out and trample essentially whatever disruption would try to pull them apart, disrupt their peace. So that sense of really being unified and of following and trusting. Becky wrote in about this sense of a bumper sticker that says, God is my co-pilot. And she's saying, nope, God is our pilot. And that's great. That's a great analogy, Becky. It's the same idea that we're not at the center with God as like our divine assistant, right? That we are what God is doing. So God is the doer. God is the presence of what's doing, the action, and we are what is done. And I guess to me what that means is that we can relax, that we can stop being anxious about perfectionism, about accomplishing things, about running ourselves ragged to try to accomplish so much, that we can see the harmony that already exists and participate in it, as opposed to having to be in charge all the time. Now, for those of you that are CEOs yourself, or are in charge of families, or in charge of projects, or in charge of church groups or whatever, this is not to say that we don't hold shepherding offices in our lives. But what it is to say is that when we have a job to shepherd others, and we look at our beingness first, the being still, in that stillness, in our being, as we are being shepherded by divine presence, we can better shepherd our projects, our kids, our church groups, our community events, or whatever it is that you have to shepherd in your life. When we are feeling that sense of being shepherded, that we're cared for, it's similar to that analogy of being on a plane, and that we put the mask on ourselves first, and then we help others. That when we're filled up with that sense of presence, of divine presence in our being, then we can go into the busiest day, the most anxious situation with a sense of stillness, and it can transform the whole event around us. And we don't become so anxious, and we don't have to take on all that responsibility. So this was what I was thinking about that day I was in bed for the day. Just really accepting and wanting to imbibe kind of all those qualities of the sheep. And it changed my relationship to myself, and to my prayers in the morning, and to this concept of God. And as I let go of all the responsibility, and feeling so in charge, and feeling like it was all dependent on me, it was all on my shoulders, and I turned towards that understanding of being the outcome of God, all the pain melted away as well. And I just felt this deep, settled sense of calm in my being. And just for one more minute or so on healing in Christian Science, that every healing like that changes our body starts with an understanding of that relationship with God, not with a problem. It's not a problem-solving prayer where we articulate our problem and then we reason through it with prayer and we hope to get to a solution. We always start with that vision of what it's like to be at peace, or what it's like to be shepherded by God. All right, we got to move on. There's a brief cartoon on your screen that says, "You can't unfollow me. I'm your shepherd." It's a sheep on a cell phone. And the point of it, again, is we can't disconnect from that shepherding influence. It's as close to us as our feelings, as our thoughts. We know God in our thoughts. That presence of love, the presence of the shepherding influence, is something we know in consciousness. This is a quote from Mary Baker Eddy, just to close this section before we move on. And she said that to the burdened and weary, Jesus saith, "Come unto me. There remaineth a rest for the righteous, a rest in Christ, a peace in love. The thought of it stills complaint. The heaving surf of life's troubled sea foams itself away, and underneath is a deep settled calm. That calm is already there. It just takes sometimes putting off all the responsibility, the control, the willfulness, the anxiety, the tension, the pressure, the stress, quieting all those racing thoughts to discover what's already there." Now, in the second part here, we'll just talk briefly about the healing power of stillness for our relationships with others. And the idea that has helped me so much in this section is something that Paul said as he traveled around and talked about Christianity after Jesus was around. He said, "You have the mind of Christ. Let the same mind be in you that was in Christ Jesus." Now, what this means to me is that we get our information about others not from their behavior, but from the way that God tells us about them, from what God is talking to us about them, from that shepherding voice about other people. That rather than living in reaction, we can live in response to the Christ impulse. And I'll just tell you a little story about this, that I had a friend who woke up one morning and she had this rash covering her arms and her legs, and it was really, really itchy, this red, itchy rash everywhere. And she was just living in this state of agitation and wanting to itch it, and it was bothering her. And she had niggling little thoughts about what might have caused it. Was it something she ate? And she didn't really want to listen to those thoughts. She had grown up as a practicing student of Christian Science, and she was used to finding solutions through praying and through finding stillness, but it was really difficult to settle all the agitation and the worry and the concern about what this condition was in her body. Well, as the day progressed and she wasn't finding any relief, finally at the end of the day, she went for a walk with her husband, and they walked into the center of their town. And there's this beautiful river in the town, and it was a full moon that night. And they stopped at a bridge overlooking the river, and the river was so calm on the surface that she could see the full moon perfectly reflected on the surface of the water. And as she watched, a breeze came up and it ruffled the surface of the water. And the moon on the water shattered into a million little fragments. She looked up at the moon in the sky, and of course it was still whole and complete and shining and radiant. And as she looked back down at the water and watched, the breeze suddenly died down and calmed, and the moon came back together again. The moon on the surface of the water, the reflected moon. And immediately this little haiku poem popped into her head, and it goes like this: "Broken and broken again on the wave, how easily mends the moon." She, in that moment, was so struck by this poem that she hadn't thought about in years that she walked home pondering the message of this little poem and what she had seen on the water. And she realized that it's in the calm, in the stillness, that the reflection is pure and complete and reflects perfectly the original. And she got thinking about herself as that reflected idea of divine love and divine presence that's always still, that's always at peace, that doesn't include anxiety or worry or agitation or rash or illness. And she started to think about just finding that sense of calm and peace. And by the time she got home, she felt this great sense of stillness. She was still pondering the poem, broken and broken again on the wave, how easily mends the moon, and thought about just it's in the stillness that the moon mended. Well, she fell asleep thinking about these ideas. She woke up the next morning and the rash was entirely gone, and it never came back. It just was, there was no sign of it whatsoever. And she got thinking about this idea from Mary Baker Eddy from in the book Science and Health, that when we're absorbed in our thought, when our thought is absorbed in material selfhood, in other words, in pondering our physical body or sort of material thoughts or analyzing our, things that going through our head, or just whenever we're absorbed in that way, that we discern and reflect, but faintly, the substance of life or mind. And life or mind in this instance are they're aspects of God's presence, of divine presence, divine life, and divine mind, sort of a universal divine consciousness that we all are part of. And so when we let go of that absorption with our bodies, with our material selfhood, that we start to reflect more fully that true substance. And that's what she felt like occurred for her in that moment, that when she stopped analyzing and worrying and thinking about so anxiously what to do about her body, and she was pondering something else, the whole condition just resolved. And the reason that this is so key for me in terms of our relationships with others is that whatever would make us agitated, whether it's a rash in our body or whether it's agitated in our thought, that having the mind of Christ allows us to experience those moments of little inspiration. When she got quiet on the bridge, this little idea popped in her head. That is what we call the Christ. It comes in a way we can understand, in a moment of inspiration, directly from divine love, from God to us, to each one of us, in consciousness. And when we hear that message from Christ, it just shifts the way we're thinking. And that shifts our experience with others, with our bodies, with whatever might be agitating us in relationships. The Christ interrupts it and gives us information, new information to think, so that we're not stuck in repetitive patterns of, oh, here we go again. She's about to say this and she always acts like this and I always respond like this. The Christ is what interrupts those patterns, so we can have fresh thinking and new ideas come to us that break through the repetitive patterns in human relationships. Mary Baker Eddy wrote this. She said, "We should adopt the spirit of the Savior's ministry and abide in such a spiritual attitude as will draw others unto us. Mind revolves on a spiritual axis, and its power is displayed and its presence felt in eternal stillness and immovable love. We feel divine presence in the stillness." And when we are in a relationship and we're about to react to that person we always react to in the same old way because, gosh darn it, he's doing the same thing again that we don't like him doing, the Christ is this divine influence that just, as we pause for a moment of stillness, the Christ has space to intervene and give us something new to think about. All right, let's close our talk tonight. We're almost at the end of our hour together with just addressing this for the world. It's the same ideas. Whether it's for ourselves or for others or for the world, it's all sort of the same approach, that we find the stillness. We quiet those racing thoughts in our head as best we can, to put them aside for a minute and focus on that sense of knowing God, And it has an influence on our bodies and our relationships and our health in bringing new inspiration, and also in helping us to not live in a reaction to world events. And here's a little story that's helped me think about this. Years ago, I worked in the peace building field, and this was a story that we heard about a contest for drawing what peace looked like. So all these children drew these pictures and they sent them into the contest. And the winning image was this. The child had drawn a rushing, roaring waterfall that was spilling and tumbling over rocks and spilling into the pool below. It was all turbulent. And if you've ever been near one of these waterfalls, it's not a quiet place. It's very loud. But right behind the waterfall, on a little ledge, the child had drawn a yellow canary. And the canary, the little canary bird, was pictured as singing. Now, I'm not going to take the time now because we're near the end to have you chat in what that means to you. You're welcome to if you want, actually. If you want to chat in the chat box what that story means to you about peace, that would be great. But for the sake of time, I'll keep moving. But one of the things that it means to me, and I don't know what strikes you, but is just that sense of being undisturbed. That the little tiny canary bird, and then this huge waterfall, that the canary is still singing no matter how loud the waterfall gets. And the canary is not in the waterfall, right? It's right next to it. So the canary is not ignoring it. It's not a picture without the turbulence. The turbulence is right there. But the canary has not gotten enmeshed in the turbulence. And so it's able to keep singing. Remaining undisturbed about world events, or getting to the point of being undisturbed if we are feeling disturbed, is one of the most useful things we can do for civilization today. Because as much as often as we maintain our voice, no matter how little it may seem, probably nobody could hear the canary. The waterfall was so loud. The canary didn't care. The canary is still singing. As we work in ourselves to find that stillness in our being, to connect with stillness, when we hear something on the news, when we are tempted to say, oh, here we go again. She always does this. I can't believe she's talking like this again, or I can't believe he said this again. That when we put those things aside and connect with just getting still, just quieting the human opinions, the thoughts, the anxieties, and we get to that point of stillness, it moves thought. And I'll just share one more story with you before we close. And this story is of a woman that lived in Germany during the time of the Berlin Wall. And I heard her speak when I was 20 years old, years ago. And being 20 was significant, I'll tell you why. She was speaking about praying every single day for 10 years for the wall to come down between East and West Germany. Now, being 20 years old at the time, this was half my lifetime at that moment that this woman prayed every day without seeing any results. And I just felt incredulous. So I went up to her afterwards and I just said, how did you keep praying for all that time without seeing results? And I'll never forget what she said to me. She said, Laurie, the wall came down in a moment, but it wasn't the work of a moment. It was the work of all those moments leading up to that precise end that shifted thought. And then she said, and what do you think changes thought? She said, every time she prayed and got really still and could feel that presence of love acting on human thought, she knew that there was a shift happening, but the shift was mental first. It wasn't so much about remove the wall. She was focused on let's shift consciousness so the wall is no longer needed. The wall was the result of the change in thought. And each one of us can influence the world in the same way. That every single time you take what is tempting to be agitating for you in the world, and rather than talking to the people that agree with you politically about how many problems there are and the negative direction we're going in and how it's often hopeless and we don't know that there's any solution, et cetera, that if we can find in ourselves that sense of being still and knowing the power of God to shift thought, we are now contributing to that change in thinking. Every single time we get still and find peace, it changes something in the mental tapestry that has to shift first before the end of gun violence in the world, before the end of fighting and attacks on Muslims or on Christians, before the division is healed between Democrats and Republicans in our country, or between family members that can't talk because they're on different sides of the political spectrum. Before that happens, there has to be a shift mentally, and every one of us can participate in that. And I'll just close with what Mary Baker Eddy says about this. She says, the best spiritual type of the best spiritual type of Christly method for uplifting human thought and imparting divine action, divine truth, imparting divine truth, is stationary power, stillness, and strength. The best type of method to uplift thought and impart truth is stationary power, stillness, and strength. And when this spiritual ideal is made our own, it becomes the model for human action. So every single time we reach that place of feeling that sense of stillness for ourselves, and we feel that sort of stationary power inside ourselves, we are participating in creating that model for human action, for the way that thought can shift so that the result can be seen in the world. So there is no prayer, there's no effort for stillness that's too small on behalf of the world. So we've come to the end of our hour together, and I just want to thank you all for participating tonight. Thank you to First Church of Christ Scientists, Austin, Texas, for sponsoring this event this evening. Thank you all for joining us from all over the world. And I will be happy to stay on for the next about 15 minutes and answer any questions that you may have. So if you need to go, that's great. Thanks for joining us. Otherwise, I'll be happy to just be here to answer any questions. Or if you have any comments that you'd like to make, any responses that you're having to this talk tonight, anything it's made you think about that you didn't get to share earlier that you'd like to chat in, just go ahead and find the question and answer box, and we will go ahead and I turned off the chat box, so you'll have to find your Q&A box now and put your questions and answers in there. But if you have any comments or responses or anything at all, go ahead and just type it into the question and answer box, and we'll spend a few minutes talking about that. And otherwise, again, thank you all for coming tonight and for joining us from around the world. And I hope you take a little bit of the stillness with you, and that you heard something in your own heart speaking tonight. So I'll sign off, but I'll just stay on in case there's any individual questions that you'd like to pose. So thanks so much. Have a beautiful evening of stillness.